Well, good morning. I'm looking forward to another wonderful session this morning, and it's great to see so many of you back here, and I imagine there will be some more, and there's even one newcomer. I want to take this opportunity to give thanks to the people who made this amazing conference possible. Lizzie Feidelson, the Center's administrative manager, has worked wonders to make this center happen. And when the when the rug was pulled out from us, we found another rug. And it's just been like that. One amazing setback after another. But we always persevered, and Lizzie was right there driving things forward. Never have I seen such a mix of capability and energy as she has shown over the past year. Thank you very much, Lizzie. I also want to say that my assistant, Catherine Pikula, is another amazing character. She has helped me with everything I do at the center, bar none. She knows every move I make, everything I ever wrote, everything I ever said. She's my memory, my editor. It's just, she's made the difference between enjoying my role, my career, and not enjoying it. And so I'm very grateful to Catherine Pikula for sticking with me through thick and thin. Without further ado, I give the floor to Peter for his presentation.
Okay, well, thank you, Ned, and it was a great honor to be asked to take part in this anniversary. I have very happy memories of the first of your conferences, your Festschrift, which took place in an even more trying time than now, and I know that it was such a happy occasion for so many of us, and really sort of filled us with hope that things would carry on. And you've carried on amazingly for the past 20 years. Congratulations for everything that's happened. So my talk today was put together along with my co-author of 34 years, Philippe Aguillon, and here he is, couldn't be with us in person. And it's based on the work that we've done for the past 34 years, really, on what we call Schumpeterian economic growth. And so I'll also be channeling this man, but only to a small extent. Our theory is, of course, based on the idea of creative destruction, the idea that a dynamic economy, in order to sustain growth, has to be continually renewed with new innovations that render obsolete old innovations, and which in turn are destined to be rendered obsolete themselves. It turns out that this process, the theory that we've worked out, is very conventional, mainstream, neoclassical in its construction, but it has some fairly radical implications, I think. And I think it has, in particular, some implications that help to explain this particular phenomenon, the recent burst of productivity growth in the U.S., but the even more recent stagnation that's taken place. There are a lot of explanations out there. I'm after Ian Golden's presentation yesterday, I'm ashamed to only present 3 of them here. He talked about 22 of them. But these are 3 explanations that have appeared in the mainstream conventional economics literature. There's the first one, of course, that for which Robert Gordon is famous, the argument that really all of the great innovations have already been made, and we've just got to get used to the fact that we're not going to be making technological progress as we did in the past. There may be something to that, although I think it's questionable, and I tend to side with Joel Mokyr in his skepticism about this argument. There are also a number of measurement issues which turn out to be, as Ian was saying yesterday, fairly limited in scope, important though they may be in certain sectors, and they don't exhibit the kind of timing that's needed to explain the recent ups and downs of productivity growth. I doubt if there's one single explanation for what's going on, but certainly there's room for a lot more. And it turns out that our theory does have some very definite implications that I think shed some light. And they have to do with one of the general approaches, which I was happy to see Ian Golden included on his final short list of 3 or 4 that made the cut. And it emphasizes the role of what David Otter and others call superstar firms, highly productive firms, use relatively little labor, are very profitable, and have come to dominate in a lot of industries. And our theory implies that under many circumstances, if you get a proliferation of highly productive firms dominating a large number of industries in the economy, that will tend to suppress the process of creative destruction. So to see how that works, it helps to go back to the theory and talk about how it works. The most important thing is that once you put creative destruction in the heart of a growth model, you have to realize something that's been obvious to economic historians for a long time, but which hadn't really made its way into aggregate growth theory before, which is that technical progress and economic growth creates losers as well as winners. It creates losses for the people whose fortunes depend upon the technologies that are rendered obsolete. And more generally, in the kinds of theories that we have been developing, there are heterogeneous people in different industries with different interests. There are leaders and followers, there are incumbents, there are potential entrants, and so on. Some of whom have a great interest in making technical progress, and others who have an interest in blocking technical progress. And in particular, the theory has a very Marxian kind of implication, which is that the process of creative destruction really does contain within itself the seeds of its own destruction. There are a couple of mechanisms whereby if you do get a lot of highly successful firms dominating a number of industries, that tends to reduce or perhaps even in some circumstances eliminate the prospect for technological progress in those sectors. And there are 2 classes of mechanisms whereby this happens. One of them is what I would call the automatic mechanism. When we take into account that technical progress generally has to take place step by step, so that when one firm is a long way behind the leader in that industry, it's not just one leapfrogging innovation that's going to make a leader out of the follower, but it may take a succession of innovations in order to catch up. Then you realize that how innovative a particular industry is going to be depends very much on the competitive situation in that industry. And in particular, the most innovative industries tend to be ones where the motive of escaping competition is strongest. That's the case where you've got firms that are competing intensively and fairly neck and neck technologically, and it's like Ethel Merman used to say, you got to have a gimmick. They've got to break away from this technology by having an innovation in order to generate profits. And that turns out in our theory, when we quantify things, to be the strongest motive for innovation. And on the contrary, you get the least innovation in a sector that is where there's not a lot of intense competition. The market is shared by a small number of firms that have a great lead over their followers. And in that situation, the leaders aren't really threatened by very much by the followers, and the followers have such dim prospects of catching up because they're so far behind that they tend to find the expenditures on R&D not worthwhile. And that's where you tend to find that innovation is the weakest. And it turns out that under some circumstances, you can even get complete stagnation, that nobody innovates in the industry. So there's a lot of evidence that these so-called superstar firms are really dominating in many industries. And I know many of you will be familiar with this sort of evidence. Otto and his co-authors have a recent paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics that spells out this evidence very clearly in U.S. Industries. You've got the phenomenon of increasing concentration, which has been taking place for quite some time. Firms have increased markups. There's a decreased share of labor income in value added in many sectors. There's an increased share of profits in value added. And these things are highly correlated across sectors. It's not as if you have some sectors that are getting increasingly concentrated and others where there's an increased profit share. These tend to be the same industries where they're more predominant. And it's largely a composition effect that's taking place. It's not as if all firms have higher markups than they used to across the board, as if the whole distribution of markups has shifted up. But what seems to have happened is that firms with higher markups are taking a bigger share of the market. They're taking a bigger share of employment. They're taking an even bigger share of sales because they also tend to be the firms that have that generate the least share of labor income in their value added. And these are big effects. So, for example, Jan de Lucker and co-authors in a recent Quarterly Journal paper have shown that since the 1980s, the average markup in U.S. Firms has gone from about 21% over marginal cost to somewhere like 61% over marginal cost. The Gustavo Grullon has argued that across three-digit U.S. industries, the Herfindahl index, Herfindahl index, which is the standard measure that the Justice Department uses in antitrust actions, is up in the past 20 years in 75% of those three-digit industries, and by an average of over 65%. So these are really big numbers. The same is true for all of these other effects. A recent paper by Aksigit and Ates has argued that there's also evidence of widespread slowdown in business dynamism that we think is really related to this. So, for example, and these are things that are all things that you would expect if you had a large number of industries that had come to be dominated by large firms that were successful in suppressing the creative destruction process, successful in discouraging or preventing entry and innovation by follower firms. So, for example, the technology gap between leaders and laggards in various industries appears to be growing. This is a paper by Dan Andrews a few years ago, an OECD working paper, that shows that the average labor productivity of the global top 5% of firms, measured by sales, many of which are American firms, rose by about 30% in the 12 years following 2001, whereas the other 95% of firms' productivity this is labor productivity, tended to grow by less than 10%. So, you know, it's the same sort of inequality, upper end inequality that we see in income and wealth distribution, but in here it's taking place in the labor productivity distribution. There are also, all of the other things that I've listed here are things that John Halterwanger, who's been studying creative destruction for even longer than Philippe and I have, but mainly in product and labor markets, has argued, reflecting decreased dynamism. There are reduced firm entry rates. Since the 1980s, firm entry rates, measured as the annual percentage of firms that are newly entered that year, has gone down from about 14% down to 8% in the last year that they measured, which was 2012. The employment share, likewise, of new firms has gone down from about 16% to 8%. And the job reallocation rate, which is the total annual job destruction plus job creation rate, has gone down from about 34% to 25%. And the dispersion of firm growth rates has gone down, which they attribute to relatively low activity among young firms. Young firms tend to be the firms that grow the most rapidly. And the dispersion that you see in the data normally is attributable to the fact that there are young firms growing rapidly and a lot of old firms that aren't growing as fast. That's not happening as much, and that's reducing the dispersion in the data. As I say, all of these are the sorts of things that you would expect to see from this superstar phenomenon. Why do we have these superstars? Well, you know, there are a lot of possible explanations. There are, you know, a lot of people think that we've got lots of markets where there are winner-take-all technologies that just make it natural that we're going to end up with monopolies or tight oligopolies. A lot of people think that it has to do with relaxed antitrust enforcement over the years. But there are at least 3 different papers out there in the literature now that are based on the work that Philippe and I have done that actually derive these sorts of results as an implication from particular parameter changes. And I want to just talk about them a little bit. The first one, with the increased difficulty of catch-up, comes from the paper that I mentioned by Exigit and Atez, where they take a parameter in the step-by-step catch-up model that Philippe and I have, a parameter whereby a firm that is behind the leader finds it easier to move one technology step ahead than if that firm was the leader itself. And the idea is simply the idea of technology transfer, the thing that makes catching up to a leader easier than being the leader yourself. He argued that if you just take that sort of the sort of model that we worked out and postulate a reduction in that, what we call the help factor that allows followers to catch up, you end up with the sorts of predictions that we talked about. And they managed to sort of imply almost all of these facts that I talked about. And now what does that reduction in the help factor represent? Well, it could be many things, some of which might be the automatic mechanism that I talked about, some of which might reflect the strategic mechanism. It could represent patent thickets that firms have managed to create through strategic R&D or through acquisitions. And Exigit and and Ante has mentioned that the distribution of patent ownership has really drastically changed, and that the share of patent reassignments that are now owned by the top 1% of patent owners in the US has really spiked in the last 20 years or so. It could be that that firms are able to make use of proprietary data sets, and that's just much more important in many industries than it used to be, which makes it harder to catch up. It could be a result of offshoring, because technology transfer is aided by geographical proximity, and if it's taking place around somewhere around the world, it's maybe harder to catch up. It could be just path-dependent technologies and tacit knowledge that are more important now than they used to be. Or it could be regulations that are favoring insiders. And of course, one of the strategic mechanisms that whereby firms that are leaders want to avoid competition is in lobbying and political activity. We all know about the rise in dark money. It's pretty hard to measure exactly how much of that comes from corporate incumbent firms and exactly what's going on with it. But we do have various measures of lobbying. There's a very interesting recent paper by Bertrand Bombardini and Trebi arguing that there's been a spike in lobby since 1998 in their data, and that a lot of that has been a spike in what they call connected lobbying rather than expert lobbying. That is to say, when you buy these lobbyists, what's becoming more important now, much more important, is not what the lobbyists know, but who they know. And so all of these are possible interpretations of that result of Exigent and Agit. There's another paper that Philippe has written with Bergeau, Beaupart, Clinault, and Lee that's still an MBER working paper, but I'm sure it will be published soon, that emphasizes the decreased cost of managing a large number of enterprises. They argue that modern technology has made this possible, and they point out that a lot of the phenomena that Autor point out, the decreased labor share, the increased profitability, and so on, is highly correlated with the technology intensity of a firm, and they argue that produces the same sort of result. Mien, Liu, and Sufi actually argue that it could just be a result of low interest rates. It turns out that our model has the implication that we didn't realize, that as the rate of interest goes to zero, the steady state equilibrium growth rate also goes to zero in that model. And because what happens is that the value of becoming a leader becomes so great that you get firms that end up establishing leads that in the end almost entirely snuff out innovation by followers and making it so hopeless. All of these are possible, but all of them tend to have the same kind of effect. And we have a little bit to say about policy. We're not really policy experts. That's not our area. There seem to be some obvious things that you could do, more vigorous antitrust, especially focusing on preemptive mergers, which seem to be a big strategy for incumbents to protect their lead, breaking up superstar firms, maybe changing patent laws to disallow a lot of the anti-competitive patenting that's taking place. But these things are all difficult. We think, and I'll just take one more minute to suggest that one of the most obvious remedies would be to try something that the United States has tried in the past that has worked spectacularly successfully, which is industrial policy. The Department of Agriculture, for example, had a spectacularly successful policy of experimental stations, which over the period from the 1930s up until and through the 1980s led to sustained productivity growth, the introduction of scientific farming into the United States, and a lot of it was focused on producing the hybrid seeds the research on which Zvi Grillikas once estimated many years ago to have a social rate of return of over 700% per year. It was an amazingly successful story. Another successful story has been the efforts of the U.S. Department of Defense to promote computer technology. Research that was sponsored by or created by the Department of Defense produced the first computer, the first operating system, the first programming language. It established the protocols for the internet. So this is something that's been done. Where would you target next? Well, it seems obvious to us that you should be targeting some sector that's been stagnant for a long time, that's dominated by a lot of politically connected insiders, and where innovation would clearly be very productive. And why not the energy sector? It's not that we think that we can solve the climate problem with doing this, it just seems obvious. If I interpret him correctly, this is the same argument that Luigi Paganetta was making yesterday. You want to revive innovation, where best to do it? But here. I know that there are a lot of arguments that will be made that governments can't pick winners. But in this case, it seems that if you're going to be promoting innovation and you don't promote some disruptive innovation in the energy sectors, you're just going to be picking losers. And I'll stop there.
And I know we can all hear each other, but this is good for the video.
Yeah, am I allowed to ask two questions? Because the last point raised one that I'd like to ask about, and then I'd like to ask a more general question here about superstar firms. So the first question is, isn't the energy sector, between fracking and the huge reduction in natural gas costs, a particularly innovative sector already?
The social rate of return of those innovations, I don't think, has been all that great. The fracking has resulted in a lot of methane escaping into the atmosphere, for example. It's been producing earthquakes all over the place. I mean, there are a lot of negative costs about this. That's not a long-term solution. And the thing you have to remember is that when it comes to energy innovations, there's a lot of path dependence. There's a lot of lock-in. Once the more you promote innovation of one particular energy source, the easier it is for further innovations to take place in that direction. And there's quite a bit of evidence producing this. Natural gas is not a long-run solution to the climate problem, I don't think. And I would argue that if there's ever been an example of success in governments promoting targeted innovation, it has been the success of the U.S. and various European governments in promoting the production of electricity through renewable sources. It is now almost everywhere in the world much privately less expensive to produce electricity using solar and wind power than it is by burning fossil fuels. There's still a lot of innovations to be done in the storage and distribution and use of this energy and so forth, but there's been a tremendous success there.
Okay, so the second question is that when you look at these superstar firms, as opposed to sort of the old generation of firms, one of the things that seems to be there in technology is that they're much more highly specialized than in the past. So if you look at IT, Google does only search. Amazon basically makes all its money on cloud computing, which is a part of the business. Yeah. Oracle does database systems. Microsoft does core systems. In the old days, IBM did everything. Is that a factor here or not?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that may be true of Google. It's not true of Alphabet, and I don't know of I don't know of what sort of spillovers and synergies there are across those sectors. I mean, the argument that Philippe has been pushing is that it's become cheaper to branch out and innovate into different sectors, which is what a lot, and now Meta, I guess, is supposed to be the next example of that. Yeah, so I'm not sure where the question was going. But,
Well, if there is something else going on, which is
Yeah.
leading to specialization rather than, and Alphabet makes no money outside of Google.
really?
Nothing. I mean, you can see the financials. So, and, you know, Microsoft, when it goes into Xbox, makes no money.
Yeah.
But if that's what's going on, it suggests that there are other things taking place here.
I'm sure there are other things taking place. I would not argue that this is a silver bullet to explain everything. Yeah. Ned? Yeah.
Well, first of all, thanks for this lucid Oh, God. Thanks for this lucid exposition of the Howitt thesis, which has had huge influence, and justifiably so. It has Schumpeterian roots. I think it's fair to say. If it's not fair to say, please correct me. I think the basic thought is that new commercial ideas are made possible by scientific advances and maybe a broader category of advances. And I just want to say that there is another perspective on this subject, and there's room for two perspectives, I think. In another perspective, my book, Mass Flourishing, tells the story of the role of values in quickening the pace of innovation in America and later in France and Germany, but especially America. And you might say this is an outlandish idea. Values, this is not economics, but I think it has a huge role to play in human behavior. So 7 years later, my research team and I came out with another book, Dynamism, which puts to test the idea about the importance of values, and it came out surprisingly well, or came out very well. I wish we had data on more values that are left out by the people who do values, but using all the data that we could use, we did find that values correlate enormously. Differences in values across countries correlate enormously well with differences in the rate of indigenous innovation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I might just say one thing about that relates to our last point about green energy. There are a number of people have argued, and I think it's correct, that one way we can really promote decarbonizing innovations is through public opinion. There's you know, even in the United States, green energy is extremely popular in opinion polls, and there's a lot of evidence that firms really want to be considered on the good side of this. Even the American Petroleum Institute has an Energy for Progress public relations campaign that presents them as the defenders of the environment. You know, you have to somehow keep these people honest from time to time, but there is I think evidence that consumer values do direct corporate innovation in many cases.
So I know there's so many questions, but I feel we should move on, not to get too far behind. Maybe we can circle back at the end and just have some more time. but let's go to Michelle now.